Okay, good to go. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Fairgrieve. I am the president of the Nassau County Historical Society. We want to welcome everybody. We're hoping maybe that for the December meeting, we can be in person. We are seriously talking about it, and I really hope we can get away from these Zoom meetings and get in person and shake hands again and talk to everybody in person. We have an exciting program today. Allison has really worked very hard, and Natalie will tell you about it. So if you got a notification that we're recording this meeting, just press the continue button. All we will be recording are the remarks made by myself and our speakers reviewing on our website later by those who missed the meeting or want to view it again. We'd like to know how you heard about this meeting, so I'll ask you to select items from the poll we're putting on your screen and submit it. The poll is going to go up now, and please tell us how you found out. So finally, when you log off from the webinar, you'll get a brief survey asking for your anonymous review of today's meeting. Your input is welcome, and it only takes a couple of seconds to complete. If you have a question, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer the questions at the end of the talk. Now I would like to introduce Natalie Naylor, our past president, and also the editor of the journal.
Thank you, Scott. And I add my welcome to everyone who's with us today. And I'd like to remind our members first that you received renewal notices this past week for dues, together with the announcement of this program in postal mail. Those renewal notices were delayed because of the pandemic and a change in the membership chair. Apologies for that, but let me take this opportunity to thank Denwood Collins for his many years of service as webmaster and membership chair. When he stepped down, we realized how much he had been doing. We divided his responsibilities. We welcome new members. Our website, www.nassaucountyhistoricalsociety.org, has membership information, and you can join or renew online, or you can make a contribution there if you would like to our society. Our website has information on our annual journal and indexes to 75 years of articles. We're working on getting the journals digitized online. There are links to previous webinars are on the calendar page of our website. Our new webmaster will soon have descriptions of upcoming programs online, but I can tell you our next program will be on Sunday, October 17th, which will be on the Harlem Hellfighters. They were a Black unit who fought in World War I. They've been in the news recently because they received a Congressional Gold Medal. There are at least 40 men from Locust Valley, Seacliff, Oyster Bay, and Glen Cove who served in that unit during the war. The title of the presentation is The Harlem Hellfighters, Bigotry, Bravery, and Jazz. Again, the date is Sunday, October 17th. The speaker is Richard Harris. It is my pleasure now to introduce today's speaker. Allison Mcgovern is an anthropological public archaeologist who uses historical research in her work, and that's a great combination of fields. She works with Richard Grubb and Associates for contract archaeology. She's co-editor of a book, The Archaeology of Race in the Northeast, and is currently working on a book entitled Long Island Dirt. She has worked on a number of Long Island sites, many dealing with African Americans and Native Americans. Her talk today is entitled Long Island Dirt, Recovering Our Buried Past Through Historical Archaeologies. Her focus will be on Long Island's Native American Indians. So without further ado, and I hope everything goes, I'll hit my mute. Scott, why don't you stop your video?
Shall I go now?
Yes, you're on.
Okay, I'm on. All right. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited about this presentation, which I want to start out by saying in the very beginning that I encourage people to reach out to me with questions, whether it is today or later on, through email after the presentation is over, because I'm going to present some information today that I think is challenging from my perspective to talk about. And if there's confusion or if there's areas that people think that it might be helpful to have more information, I certainly want to hear about that. My work that I'm presenting today is sort of a work in progress for a project that I'm working on called Long Island Dirt. It is a manuscript project that is, let me see, just give me 1 second. I'm gonna hide some things here. It's a manuscript project that is funded by a writing fellowship at the Gotham Center for New York City History. It's called Long Island Dirt, and it really feels ambitious sometimes when I'm working on it. It's a personal approach to understanding the many histories and pasts that make up this place called Long Island. It's a place that many of us call home, and it's a place that is rich in diverse histories, peoples, and narratives. And for those of us who live here, we know what it means to have neighbors, to be a part of a community. And we know, even though we often can't define it, that our identities as Long Islanders are shaped by the region in which we live and how our communities are defined in relation to each other. So, Long Islanders are familiar with the North Shore versus South Shore communities, Suffolk County versus Nassau County, not to mention Brooklyn and Queens, which are geographically part of Long Island, but many would argue are culturally very different than the places of Suffolk County and Nassau County. All of this is really to say that Long Island identity is tied up within a series of boundaries and relationships that are not so easily understood from outsiders. And this interests me as an anthropologist and as a historian. I'm interested in how understanding of the present can be informed by the past. So my goal with this project is to use archaeological data from particular locales or particular locations to build place-based narratives, and then try to tie those place-based narratives together into some big picture discussions of Long Island history, because I think that this will also shed light on how we as contemporary Long Islanders relate to each other, how we relate to the island, and how we relate to the region. So archaeology, and in particular historical archaeology, provides a method for understanding lived experiences at the place-based level, or like the micro level. Historical archaeology in particular relies on multiple lines of evidence, and some of those resources are pictured here. In addition to the recovery of artifacts and archaeological features, which are recovered by the process of digging with shovels and trowels, we also rely on historic maps to see if there's evidence of buildings or structures on the site. We reference those maps, especially if they have ownership on them, with census data to get a sense of how many people lived in a particular house or building, what they did for work, and how they're identified by government officials. For more specific information, economic information, for instance, we could consult account books and diaries that may be available in the special collection sections of our local libraries. And another very important, but often too overlooked resource is interviews and conversations with descendants and local residents. Basically, the various stakeholders who might have information about the people who lived at the site. So through the use of all of these types of resources, we're able to investigate aspects of the past that might not be readily available through other historical accounts. And so we look at topics like economic strategies, what people did for work, and different attributes of ethnicity, race, class, and gender. And some of those resources, as I mentioned, are pictured here. The upper left that's me excavating at the East Hampton Historical Farm Museum several years ago. The lower left is a picture of a research project that I've been involved with called Mapping Memories of Freetown, where we are gathering input from descendants and local stakeholders about developing a historical narrative for the neighborhood. Other resources pictured here include a census page from 1840. There's a 1873 map of the Brookhaven area with a site circled, which is one of the places that I did archaeology at. And on the far right is a picture of an account book page from an account book at the East Hampton Library Long Island History Collection. And this page in particular shows economic transactions by George Farrow and Stephen Farrow, who were Montaukets, and this dates to, I believe, between 1790 and 1814, within that period. So not all archaeological sites receive equal attention in terms of research. That's an important thing to point out. The other thing I wanted to mention is that the vast majority of archaeological research that is done in this country is done for compliance purposes. And that's often as a part of a series of environmental reviews. So I think what most people don't generally think about archaeology being done for environmental review or compliance purposes, but in our country, most archaeologists are employed doing this work in what's called cultural resources management. And the archaeological research that's done is usually requested by an agency. It could be like the New York State Historic Preservation Office or the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. But here on Long Island, we also have several town planning boards that request archaeological review when a new development project is about to happen. So the way that archaeology is done is dictated by regulations for when and how the archaeological work proceeds. And we typically do what's called phased archaeological work, where we might start out in a particular area with a phase 1 archaeological survey to just test for the presence and absence of archaeological sites on a property. And if material is found during that phase 1, it might proceed to a phase 2 and a phase 3. So like I said, most archaeology in this country is done as part of this process, as opposed to academic projects that are done out of a university. Now, while archaeological work is being done all of the time, the results of that research don't necessarily get shared with the public. So most of this research gets buried in what's called the gray literature, which are archaeological reports that get filed with the agency that requested the work, and they get filed on a system that's pictured here, the CRIS system, which is the Cultural Resources Information System, which maintains all of New York State's archaeological site files. And so this is used to keep a record of where archaeological sites are found, and it provides a sensitivity model, so that if new development is happening in an area, we can have a sense of whether or not that new development may impact archaeological resources. So my main purpose with the work Long Island Dirt is to highlight some of the research that's generated through contract archaeology and share it in a book for the public to read. And in the process, I'm trying to connect these archaeology at local sites to a more regional understanding of Long Island histories. I chose the title Long Island Dirt because I thought it was a fun play on words. Obviously, as an archaeologist, I work or play in the dirt. I use a method that requires digging holes in trenches to recover artifacts that are preserved in dirt for hundreds or perhaps thousands of years. And so, what you see pictured here are some of the, it's basically me at work. On the left, these are some quartz, pieces of quartz flakes, or the residue of stone tool manufacture at a site in Setauket. And on the right, you see field work at the Peter Crippen House in Huntington, which was the home of an African-American family from about 1860 to about, oh gosh, like 1980, between 1980 and 2000. So, and so that's actually ongoing work there on the right. But I also think it's fun to think about what the word dirt means for talk or gossip, stories about people. And so I like the idea that I'm also playing with notions of narrative in this book called Long Island Dirt. And for those of you who are familiar with my work, you know that a lot of it challenges dominant narratives. So I'm interested in alternative ways of exploring the past and shedding light on the lives of people who've been marginalized in historical narratives. So in a way, I feel like I'm generating new dirt on people. And this becomes evocative, especially when you consider what archaeologists are actually exploring, which are the trash deposits of past peoples in what's called middens, which is a fancy word for a garbage dump, or even in privies, if we're lucky, right? Or outhouses like the one you see pictured on the right. Which, if you think about your own household trash, it can be very revealing for some quite personal things about how we live our lives. And that's the major source of material that archaeologists are working with. So Long Island Dirt is about exploring what we can learn from local sites and how those local sites might be connected to other sites on Long Island, and developing a more regional understanding of Long Island's past by connecting people and places through time and space. In order to do this, it's important for us to understand the histories of all peoples on Long Island. Then we can understand their movements, we can understand their connections with each other, and we can understand their changes to their lives and cultures over time. So we can come to a more complete understanding of collective Long Island identities. So today I wanted to discuss the relationship between archaeology and Long Island's indigenous communities. Long Island's indigenous ancestors are the original peoples, right? The earliest inhabitants of the region. And when people generally think of 19th century histories of Long Island, the indigenous peoples and tribal communities are generally marginalized from those historical accounts. And I wanted to talk about why that is. And that today, that marginalization largely has to do with the work of archaeologists, which is what I wanted to talk about today. Native American history continues to be an important subject for contemporary archaeology, and much has been written about these sites in the gray literature. But today I wanted to talk about the historical relationship between Native American people and archaeologists, with archaeology as a method for documenting history. So going back deep into time, Long Island's earliest inhabitants date back to tens of thousands of years, when Long Island wasn't even an island yet, and the island extended out into the continental shelf. And I borrowed some of this imagery from sites on the web, and you can absolutely get in touch with me afterwards if you'd like more detailed information about the sources associated with these. So material or archaeological traces are few and far between for those earliest times. And we would expect that more than a few artifacts from coastal settlers during this early period have been submerged from sea level rise, now buried on seafloors off the coast. The histories of those past peoples are recorded in indigenous origin narratives, remembered by modern tribal groups on Long Island and throughout southern New England. Southern New England. These were the lands of contemporary indigenous people and tribal groups. To name a few, the Shinnecock, the Unkachog, and the Montaukett. Glacial retreat and sea level rise left its mark on Long Island's formation with two moraines, which are pictured on the right, that form the knobby backbone of the island. This glacial movement also led to the circumstances of some relatively flat plains, lakes, and ponds throughout the interior of the island. High topography and rocky beaches characterize much of the North Shore, while the sandy outwash plain and beaches represent the lower topography of the South Shore. This topography reflects the island's geological formation from glacial movement and coastal erosion. And people have always established their settlements in interesting and meaningful ways in relation to these features. If you ask any resident of the island today, whether you're from the North Shore or the South Shore, the North Fork or the South Fork, or even Up Island, there are clear distinctions in meaning and identity to Long Island's different places. And some of this is largely connected to the topographic formations that happened thousands of years ago. The indigenous ancestors settled along rivers, creeks, and coasts throughout Long Island and southern New England. They were speakers of a collective Algonquin language base, and they maintained a foraging lifestyle, intensively relying on marine and coastal resources for thousands of years prior to European arrival. People were connected throughout the region by shared cultural patterns, mutually intelligible languages, and kin connections that continued for thousands of years, and many of which continue today. So this map that I'm showing you is also borrowed from the web, and it shows basic Native American and tribal regions throughout southern New England, which was strongly connected by shared cultural and linguistic patterns. When Europeans arrived, they encountered indigenous people and groups throughout the Long Island region. Indigenous people were settled throughout the region in groups based on kin, and they would come together to defend themselves against a common enemy. And pictured here are some paintings, some portraits that I've borrowed from David Martine. He's the artist on these. And he's depicting 17th century indigenous individuals. We have the Shinnecock sachem, circa 1640 on the left, the Montaukett sachem, wine dance during the 17th century in the center, and Shinnecock woman during the 17th century pictured on the right. I really struggled with coming up with some imagery to go along with the information that's being presented today to you guys. And I really feel strongly about sharing materials that are developed by indigenous artists and historians, indigenous people in general, as a way of presenting Native American history. And I think it's really important to be able to honor this work that David Martine is doing, and many other artists. And there's actually an active exhibit right now at Reservations, Long Island, which focuses on Native American art and imagery, which I recommend to you all to go and check it out if you get a chance. So when Europeans arrived, they encounter indigenous people and groups throughout the region. And people throughout the region were connected through shared language. They were connected through kin patterns, and would come together to form alliances in protection or in hunting efforts. But think largely about people being spread out in villages, kin-based villages throughout the region. And that idea that people are spread out in kin-based villages is somewhat in conflict with a more common way that Native American history is told and retold in historical accounts, right? So in contrast, many local residents today know the Shinnecock and the Unkachog and the Montaukett as among the 13 tribes of Indians that once occupied Long Island at the time Europeans arrived. John Strong wrote about this in the 90s, and he continues to write about it today. But really, this myth, which is frequently taught in schools and repeated in local histories, presents a really narrow idea of Indian formation. It presents indigenous socio-political formation incorrectly, and it really masks the realities of cultural and economic continuity that is highlighted in some of the archaeological sites that have been investigated throughout the region. Recent historians and archaeologists recognize this myth of the 13 tribes as problematic because it's not the history that was recorded or retold by indigenous historians, but it was instead developed by 19th century white historians more than 200 years after Europeans arrived on the shores of Long Island. Even still, archaeologists and historians alike continue to perpetuate this fiction of the 13 tribes in their writing and in their exhibits. So how does a myth like the 13 tribes get retold so frequently? Well, this mostly has to do with the way non-Indigenous observers have retold the history of Native American peoples. When Europeans first arrived in the indigenous territories in North America, those who were capable and literate wrote about the people they encountered and the lifeways that they witnessed. And these early observer accounts really framed the way Europeans would continue to view and think about indigenous peoples. There was no emphasis on indigenous description of their own lives and cultures. And so from the moment Europeans arrived, they controlled the way the rest of the world would view the people and the cultures of indigenous peoples of North and South America. And archaeology has always been a means for documenting and understanding ancient indigenous lifeways, both in the Northeast of North America, but more broadly throughout North and South America. But archaeology has also contributed a particular perspective or framing of the indigenous past as ancient peoples, frozen in time, disconnected from contemporary indigenous peoples, and often the subject of scientific investigation. Archaeological collections today reside in museums, they are in historical societies and other repositories throughout New York State, where they inform visitors about the ancient past. And these collections form a baseline for understanding indigenous lifeways. But the formation of those collections provides some really interesting information about the process of archaeology and the process of ethnological collecting over time. And these were fields within anthropology. In fact, both past and present expectations of what it means to be indigenous, right? Indigenous authenticity on Long Island in particular are strongly linked to the formation of some of these collections. Archaeological collecting on Long Island is closely connected to the formation of the Southold Indian Museum in Southold, which is located on the North Fork of the eastern end of Long Island. The Southold Indian Museum is owned and operated by the Long Island chapter of the New York State Archaeological Association. And this was a chapter of people interested in archaeology. This particular chapter, the Long Island chapter, was founded by avocational archaeologists or non-professional archaeologists, hobbyists in the 1920s. So some of those founders were Nathaniel Booth, Charles Goddard, Roy Latham, just to name a few. Most of them were Long Island farmers who grew up in the early 19th century and collected lithics from plowed fields from the time they were children. We have a picture. I think I said the early 19th century by mistake. Pardon me. So I'm getting hung up on that. But take a look at the picture that's here, and this is from the Southold Indian Museum. And it's a photo that's been reproduced several times in newspaper articles by the Suffolk County Archaeological Association, in newsletters and so forth. But from left to right, you see pictured here Roy Latham, Nat Booth, and William Griswold, and they're all excavating the remains of an Indian settlement in Southold. And I think it's a really interesting photograph. It's very telling of the historic period. You have these men fully dressed in the field, knee deep or hip deep in excavations. And this is very much where most of the archaeological collections that you would see in a historical society or museum on Long Island today come from this early period of collecting. And much of the work that these men did was curated in the Southold Indian Museum. So these men, they excavated sites. They employed methods that Latham had learned from working with Foster Seville, who was a professional archaeologist with the Museum of the American Indian Hay Foundation. And they went out and they saved lithics and pottery. They recorded finds. And in some cases, they reported on their results to other avocational archaeologists, at the regular meetings of the New York State Archaeological Association, or in write-ups for their bulletins and newsletters, things like that. They also excavated indigenous burial sites or sacred sites in Orient, Southampton, and elsewhere throughout Long Island. They were very thorough in their fieldwork, often leaving little to no portions of the sites preserved for future investigations. They also kept their artifacts recovered in private collections, some of which were kept in attics and barns until they were donated to the chapter in the second half of the 20th century. The sole purpose behind these investigations was interest, right? Self-interest, mostly self-interest in building up personal collections. There wasn't a real attention to scientific research questions asked at any of these archaeological sites. There was no consultation with living indigenous peoples in the work that these men did at archaeological sites. In fact, I think that they were really driven by the idea that the sites they were excavating were remnants of peoples and cultures that no longer existed on Long Island. And in that case, there was no need to be held accountable for digging up sacred sites because they didn't believe that they were connected to any living peoples. And that's a very different view than archaeologists and researchers who work in the field today have. But these views were continued in local historical narratives and local history exhibits. And they've been internalized through subsequent generations of Long Islanders, and they continue to guide the amateur collectors, looters, and a number of historical museums on Long Island into the 21st century. So it's very, this kind of work, right? Collecting archaeological materials, whether you're a professional or an amateur, is very influential on the way information about a particular group is presented. And I think that's what's really of importance here. Now, as archaeology began to develop as a method for collecting and understanding the past into the 19th and 20th centuries, there was also developed this tendency to consider the remnants of ancient indigenous cultures as distinct from the living indigenous and tribally organized people that were present at the time in North America. The idea that quote unquote prehistoric Indians lost their culture and disappeared was developed during these early years of archaeology and has since persisted in local historical narratives and exhibits, as it has been internalized through subsequent generations of Long Islanders. And I think for those of us who live here, we do understand the perspective that non-Indigenous people have about tribally organized people who are living on Long Island. There's definitely a lot of misunderstanding about the lifeways and the organization of Native American people on Long Island over time. But these ideas are also a legacy of the history of American archaeology. So archaeologists were, and some still are, responsible for developing these static fixed ideas of cultural groups based on archaeological materials. And these descriptions were frequently used to promote nationalist agendas. So Native American cultures were being salvaged by archaeologists and anthropologists, for instance, at the same time that Native Americans were being aggressively civilized as part of the colonial project. And one archaeological historian notes that the most important single factor that has shaped the long-term development of American archaeology has been the traditional Euro-American stereotype, which portrayed America's native peoples as being inherently unprogressive or fixed in time. In order to confirm their dominance over Native Americans, Euro-Americans created myths about them, right? Condemned as brutal murderers or romanticized as noble savages. And we see these romantic depictions of Native American people right through the 20th century. As a result, the work of archaeologists validated the conquering of Native peoples and the seizure of their lands. And I think oftentimes people don't really think about the connection between archaeology and politics. And there's a really, politics and nationalist narratives, and there really is a really strong historical connection there. And so ever since then, archaeologists have had a really difficult time engaging with the Native American presence. Now, how is archaeology different today? Well, needless to say, archaeology is continuously troubled by its engagement with the Native American presence. And this is because of its historical relationship in creating descriptions of Indigenous peoples and cultures, and archaeologists' general lack of interaction with Native American people and tribal entities. So as I mentioned earlier today, most archaeologists in this country work in what's called cultural resources management. This work is regulated by environmental laws, and archaeological fieldwork is set up to ask research questions of archaeological data before it is disturbed by new development. And these laws were developed in the 1970s. Archaeological work in CRM is therefore dependent on where and when new impacts are proposed. Or where new development is slated to happen. So in this sense, the work is not exploratory as it was in the early years of archaeology. You don't have archaeologists just going out into a farm field to explore to find a Native American site. The work is very much dictated by the boundaries of a new development project and whether or not that proposed development within those boundaries will encounter anything. And this is one of the reasons why archaeological investigations have not been done, or at least have not been reported in the New York State site files on the 2 Long Island Indian reservations that exist on Long Island. The sovereign Puspatuck or Unkachug Indians are recognized by New York State, and the sovereign Shinnecock Indians are federally recognized. Now, while their territories were historically expanded well beyond the limits of the reservations as they exist today, and archaeological collecting has been reported within those larger territories surrounding the reservations, there's no requirements for archaeology to be done on the reservations because the tribes are autonomously governed. And I think that's another misconception that people have about archaeology and Native American history, that they would assume archaeology would be done on a reservation. And it's, the fact that a reservation exists means there's a continuity of living in that particular area. And in many cases, tribal communities don't subscribe to the notion that archaeology is required to be able to tell them who they are and their identity or their place in the world. So it's really important to note that archaeology is historically a European and a Euro-American endeavor. It's a Euro-American practice. The fields of archaeology and anthropology formed during and following ages of exploration, right? As European people in particular sought explanation for the differences in the peoples and cultures they saw around the world. So in general, archaeology is not an indigenous method for history making. In contrast, while archaeology has been done within the Montaukett tribal territory and known as Indian Fields, and some might wonder why. And that one of the reasons there is, well, as is more widely known, the Montauketts are not federally or state recognized at this time. They were actually detribalized by New York State at the turn of the 20th century. The archaeology that was done at the Montaukett Indian Fields was done in the 1970s by archaeologists from the Long Island Archaeology Project out of Stony Brook University. These investigations were completed roughly 100 years after the Montauketts were dispossessed from their land in Montauk. And a whole series of events had happened from that point in 1879, when most of the Montauk land was sold at public auction, to the 1970s, when by that time the land had been purchased by Suffolk County for preservation. So the archaeological research that was performed at Indian Fields was done in consultation with Suffolk County Parks. And at the time, some of the archaeologists also consulted with Montaukett descendants on the work in order to document the presence of archaeological resources in the park, which again is sort of typical of the kind of work that was being done in the 1970s with this new attention to regulatory review and accountability in archaeology. Now, most archaeologists today are making a much better effort to consult with Indigenous people and tribal entities, just stakeholders in general, but there's some serious theoretical baggage that still needs to be handled. And for instance, I came across this statement in an archaeology report that I was rereading from 1987 for a development project that was proposed in the Santa Mariches area. And it struck me as the perfect statement that encompasses this conflict. And they wrote, although most historians seriously question the existence of 13 tribes of Indians on Long Island, many others still believe that during the 17th century, the Mariches Bay area was the main settlement for a group of Indians belonging to the Untitled tribe. And so, and I think in short, this statement really encompasses this conflict for a non-Indigenous archaeologist, right? For a Euro-American archaeologist to explain the connections between modern Indigenous people and tribal entities and how their histories have been written by their observers in the past. It is true that most 21st century historians question this organization of Long Island's Indigenous peoples into 13 tribes at the time of European arrival. It's questioned because this history of the 13 tribes was not recorded or retold by Indigenous historians, but rather by 19th century white historians more than 200 years after Europeans arrived on Long Island. And yet we still continue to perpetuate this fiction of 13 tribes in our gray literature, in our archaeological reports. And so it's really something to think about and to really work on for those of us who continue to practice in the field. And I think it also explains some of the difficulty for understanding how the Fowler House, for instance, in East Hampton is tied to an Indigenous history, because so many people think about Native American archaeological sites as being fixed in the past, that when you get to a site like the Fowler House, which is located in East Hampton and was settled by the Montauketts of Indian Fields, one particular family from Indians, from about 1880 to 1980, there becomes this conflict in people's minds and understanding of history of how do you tell a story about a Native American presence in such a contemporary period, right? Such a recent past. And that has a lot to do with the way people think about archaeological culture as being fixed in the past. So that's some of the work that I'm moving through in my study called Long Island Dirt. I feel like it's a little bit complicated sometimes, but my whole purpose is to share information from the work that I've been engaged in 20 years on Long Island to the public for a more broader understanding of archaeology and its connection to contemporary lived experience. So if anybody has any questions or has comments or disagreements, I encourage you to email me. My email is up here, ajmmcg@gmail.com, because I think it's really important to have discussions about, about Long Island history and Long Island identity. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to stop sharing and give it back over to Natalie.
Okay, thank you very much, Allison. Interesting, informative, very well done. And I don't see questions yet. I'm going to let people put questions in the chat room, and Allison had her email up there. If you just Google her name, you'll come up with her website. And if you want to read some of the papers that she's published on various aspects of those marginalized people, you can download those papers as well. So there's a wealth of information there available. Just Google her name. You mentioned the exhibit of David Martine and other his Indian Native American artists at the Preservation Long Island. I think they've got a different exhibit now, but down the road at the Whaling Museum, Cold Spring Harbor Whaling Museum, they have an exhibit where David and other Native American artists works are shown there. So the Preservation Long Island has some portraits, mostly these days, of some white Europeans, but at any rate, focused on slavery. But I see some questions in the chat room. Who want to know your website? Back up, first of all.
Okay.
And the question, while you're doing that, Rain asked, are you able to talk with modern day local descendants in your research?
Okay, that is a great question. Let me see if I can get, okay.
Yes, the website is back up.
Okay, good. Yeah, so that's a great question. Yes and no. I try very hard to connect with descendant communities in my research on a case-by-case basis. And that's also kind of hard in the work that I do as a cultural resources management archaeologist. So we're bound by certain regulations, and sometimes the regulations have rules about consultation and who directs the consultation process in different types of work. But the short answer to your question is yes, I am in contact with Indigenous folks, descendants, stakeholders in my research, and I'm always trying to find new ways to connect with more people.
Thank you. Stephen asked, legally, are the artifacts uncovered? Do they belong to the current owners of the land, the archaeological team, or the native tribes that used to occupy the land?
Well, this is also a great question. So in cultural resources management, when you do archaeology, you have like a client, and it could be the property owner. In most cases, the artifacts become the ownership of the person who owns the property, okay? And oftentimes the person who owns the site and is having the archaeology done for compliance purposes in their development project, they often don't want to keep those artifacts. So it's up to us as consultants to find a repository that will accept those artifacts, that archaeological collection. And so part of our research design in doing work is finding out, if we collect a collection that has really strong research potential, it's up to us ethically to find a home for that collection so that they're accessible to other archaeological researchers. In the matter of sacred sites, okay, it is strongly encouraged in all cases to connect with tribal entities, like the Shinnecock, for instance, are a federally recognized tribal agents, federally recognized tribe. They have a tribal historic preservation office. They have a cultural resources director, and it is, and especially when federal regulations are involved, they would ultimately be the First Nation to connect with for repository potential or decisions on what should happen with the archaeological collection. Because there are some indigenous, part of the indigenous worldview among some people is that those artifacts shouldn't be excavated, particularly sacred items, which it's almost blasphemous to even talk about them as artifacts as opposed to sacred sites, right, and sacred items. So there may also be a situation where those materials get returned to the earth, get returned to the ground, as opposed to being curated in a repository.
Let me just mention Garvey's Point Museum in Glen Cove is the closest museum that has Indian artifacts. The South Old Indian Museum you mentioned is on the North Fork, and its hours are very limited. But next question, Lisa asks, great presentation. Do you have any research of Native American and African Americans living and working together on estates, such as the Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island?
Well, a lot of my research actually focuses on labor networks, in particular between Native Americans and African descended peoples. My research tends not to be estate focused in the way the Sylvester Manor plantation is, but my work is more broad and more regional. So for instance, I've examined whaling and the labor relations and the kin relations that developed out of whaling practices, and other working strategies, in service, in day labor. So yes, and some of the academic writings that I have that you can find online talk about those connections between Native American and African American people, in particular in the East Hampton area.
And Sylvester Manor has been written about in the book, The Manor, and what is it, Boston University, I think, has published a number of articles about those African American and Native Americans there.
Yes, yeah, Catherine Hayes wrote a book called, I think it's Slavery Before Race, and it focuses on that history at Sylvester Manor Plantation.
Peter asked, could you talk a little more about the 13 tribe myth and how the different tribes were actually organized?
Oh, well, there's an excellent article that John Strong wrote from 1992. And if you email me, I'll send you the article. But yeah, it's more or less the idea that that use of the word tribe is just, it's inappropriate. It's not accurate, basically. It's just not accurate that you have the 13 tribes, which are organized by regions, right? And there's no question that Indigenous place names are strongly connected with Indigenous identity, but that there was no tribal organization within each of those 13 areas. The organization of Indigenous folks was much more loose in terms of bands and villages, and that people would come together, and formation into a tribe with a system of socio-political organization or like governing strategy comes a little bit further down the line, perhaps when it's sort of forced onto them by Europeans who need to find a leader appointed among Native American people who can, negotiate land transactions during that period. But I can, if you connect with me through email, and I will send you more information.
And I hasten to add, John Strong wrote 2 books published by Long Island Studies Institute at Hofstra when I was director, on the Algonquin peoples of Long Island, and we are still here, Algonquin people today. That goes into that myth in one or both of those. But okay, next question. Ross, the town of North Hempstead logo features a portrait of Tacapusha in an effort to honor Native American heritage. He signed the quote agreement quote to turn over a good share of land in Nassau, today's Nassau. Would you see this as a way of perpetuating the myth of the 13 tribes?
Wow, that's a really loaded question there. I don't know. I mean, well, I don't know enough to be able to answer that question at this moment, but I think that there's a lot of complexity right now, especially with the politics of using indigenous names and peoples and identities to represent different things.
Teams, yes.
Yeah. And so I think that I don't think I could answer that question. I think I need to do more research.
And Stephen goes back to an earlier question. I think very interesting, sounds like a big task. Have any human remains been uncovered unexpectedly?
Oh, well, not by me, but yes, certainly. Human remains have been uncovered. Well, it depends on who you would ask if it was unexpected, right? Because it's been a couple of instances in Southampton, which has a lot, one of the reasons why the Graves Protection Act in the town of Southampton was passed, which protects human remains that are encountered unexpectedly within the town. And so yeah, I think in some areas where human remains were encountered unexpectedly, there was no archaeological review, which made it surprising for some people, but it certainly wasn't surprising for the Shinnecock, who have been fighting for the protection of their sacred sites and ancestors for hundreds of years.
Okay, and someone who is anonymous asks or states, great talk, thank you. You made very clear that there are so many different kinds of important conversations that have to continue with descendant populations, among professionals in the field, with government agencies, with developers, and with different cross sections of the quote general quote public. What are your thoughts on ways of breaking down some of the barriers to communication and awareness that are so problematic? Your book seems like one important step, yes.
Oh, well, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, certainly this work is one of my ways of trying to do that, right? So trying to share and encourage those conversations. I think it's really tough. I think that archaeologists need to have relationships with local communities. I think that's really important. I think that they should share their data, whether it's through talks like this or through, publications in like the Long Island Historical Journal, or, sharing it with newspapers, information like just being more accessible to the public, I think is really important. And then for those of us who are trying to do this, to really encourage conversations, it needs to constantly be brought up with agencies and with other professionals in the fields. So I think one big way to break down the barriers is just to keep up the conversation with the public, the best.
I would mention that Suffolk County Archaeological
disseminating our research
published a number of books on Native American history as well. Scott says, thank you for the awesome presentation. Does your book or will your book discuss Long Island indigenous foodways? And if so, or CRM site files helpful in understanding those practices? And can I add to that, if someone is interested in seeing some of those reports, are those available to the public?
They're for the most part, they're not available to the public because they are, so archaeological sites are, in general, they're protected from the public because we're trying, archaeologists want to preserve the sites and make sure that they're not investigated or looted by by people in general, right? That they're protected. We don't want sites going out and being plundered. So the data, unfortunately, when it's restricted in the gray literature, it gets sent up to the State Historic Preservation Office. But if you're a researcher and you're interested in asking questions about that, you can negotiate access to that material, as long as you're going to keep information about places, right? Location-specific information private and protected. So to answer the question about Native American foodways, I think I don't go in, I don't know. I don't explore Native American foodways specifically with any gray literature data. I think that is a really interesting research topic though. And if you are an archaeologist or studying to be an archaeologist and you want to pursue this, I could probably help you out with some directions on how to pursue that information. I think, but there's certain questions like what time period are you looking at, what kind of data in particular you're looking at, because some of the important information about foodways comes from more deeper research projects that would come out of like a phase 3 archaeological investigation. And there's fewer of those than there are of, say, survey level archaeological work, which is really identifying the presence or absence of sites in the landscape. So no, I don't go into that specifically, but there are other resources that I could probably tune you into if you're interested in more information about that topic.
And my final question, which we'll end with, I want you to identify the lovely picture you have on the screen.
Oh, this one?
Yes.
So,
is that a site?
This is a maritime forest. This is in Center Moriches in Terrell River County Park. Let's just say that there is a long Native American history in this area. There have been some investigations surrounding this region. And I picked this photo. It's funny. I picked this photo because when I first started putting together presentations for Long Island Dirt, I'm doing it in my PowerPoint. And I guess the PowerPoint is so smart now that it picks up dirt and it picks up pictures that they think that I should use in my presentation. And it gave me a picture of like a dirt road somewhere. And it made me really think, well, what does what visual representations really come to mind when you think of Long Island Dirt? And there's so many different, right? Because the landscape is so different in different parts of the islands. And this is just a snapshot that I took one day during the pandemic. My kids and I went for a hike in Terrell River County Park, and we got down to the end of the park where it meets the bay. And it was just so beautiful that I had to take this picture. And I really hope that we can use this as cover art on the book because it's just so, I love it.
Lovely picture. Thank you so much, Allison, and thank everyone for coming today. We look forward to having you again at our next webinar, which, as I mentioned, will be on the Harlem Hellfighters, Black unit in World War I, which included men from Long Island, and the date for that is Sunday, October 17th. Please remember that after you leave the meeting, there will be a very brief survey. Just take a few seconds to do. Your rating on that is anonymous, so your feedback is important to us. So thank you again, Allison and everyone, and we appreciate your talk. Thank you for joining us today. And there's a reminder to press the leave button.
Thank you so much.
Did I miss a question? No, I don't think so.